so that we can accommodate, make sure that we can stay in contact with our special guests that we have. We all have busy schedules. So once we set something, we like to stick with it. We want to thank you guys for continuing to support the Black podcast. Our guests have continued to support us. We've continued to support them. And it's all about building a relationship so that we can pay it forward to our community. You know, we don't hear enough about our real, true stories. And many of you know I'm a sports director, and I help coaches to discover their why. I help their athletes, their student athletes, understand who they are within their space. And so it's just so important that we all dive into our why. And when we look at social media, we only see the big picture, right? We see these guests doing certain things and we think, wow, they must have had the perfect life. We don't ever get to hear their story of why they're doing the things that they're doing. Why do they wake up every morning motivated and driven to go and make an impact? People don't always think about others, right? It's easy to think about ourselves and what we need, but when you see someone out there who is always giving back, always sowing a seed, you think that they never have a tired day. You don't know what their journey has been like and what drives them. And so that's why we created this platform, so we can share those stories, because we don't hear about it enough in our community. But we have such a special guest today. And my partner, I forgot to mention my partner, Brian Street, he's actually traveling. And so I'm sure he'll dive in here with his shiny bald head eventually. But he is traveling right now. And so I got to hold it down for everybody, for me, for him, and for the Black Podcast guests and audience. So just bear with me. I've never played the producer and the host, you know. But anyways, I just wanted to make sure I mentioned that, so when he does dive in, you guys know that he is currently traveling right now. But we have a special guest. And I always say they're special, but they're special to me because I get to see why I chose them and why I went after them and attacked them and made sure that they were a guest on this show, even through their busy schedules. Just a special, special man that I'm just so excited to bring forth to our Black community. He's doing a lot already, but many of you may not know him yet or seen his social media, but you'll learn more about him shortly. But I want to bring forward Mr. Byrd. We're so excited to have you on today.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely, absolutely. And there goes Brian. Brian is in the building as well. I was just telling the audience that Brian was gone and he just reappeared. So we're gonna have two men with bald heads in a few minutes. I can only do one bald head. I got two in here now. But Mr. We want to thank you so much for just being a guest, and just being you. And it's been nice to just see the pictures and the videos. And so I really looked forward to learning more about your journey and what you're doing, and your why behind everything. Um, we always like to say that behind every glory is a story. And so we know that it's easy to look at your pictures and think that everything was laid out for you and it worked smoothly and you didn't have any trials or tribulations on this journey. But that's pictures that we see. We only get to see the result of the work, and your background. And so we like to start off with knowing more about you, where you're from, and kind of the dynamics of your family, how you grew up.
Absolutely. So I am a native of Atlanta, Georgia. I know there's a lot of talk now about, hey, what is Atlanta? What isn't Atlanta? But I was born in Crawford Long Hospital here in Atlanta. My mom actually moved up from South Georgia, and my father's side of the family has actually been in Atlanta since the 1800s in the Pittsburgh community. And so I was born basically and grew up in the Summerhill, Pittsburgh communities here in Atlanta. Shortly thereafter, my grandmother and other family members stayed in Atlanta. Myself, my four siblings, we ended up moving down to Clayton County. And so that's sort of how I grew up. I did not grow up with my father in the home. I grew up along with my four sisters, three older, one younger, and my mom. And then eventually my mother, she did get married, and I was in about fourth or fifth grade at that time. And so I did have a father figure in the home, which was helpful. But it was a relationship to where I never called him dad. I always called him by his name because I knew who my father was, and it was just a weird situation. But the point is, My mom, she did not finish high school straight out. Neither did my grandmother or my grandfather or my father for that matter. And so as I went through school, school for me was really something, more of a social experience. I tell everybody today, I went to school for two reasons: lunch and PE. Lunch and PE, that's why I went to school from elementary, middle, and high school.
Me
And,
too.
and, and the beautiful thing about it is that I didn't have a lot of pressure because my mom had not necessarily gone to college and was trying to push me into an Ivy League school or some sort of program. I was able to go to school and enjoy it and enjoy some of the social aspects of it at least. And I didn't have a lot of pressure. So that said, by the time I get to high school, we'd moved around different school systems from Fulton County to Henry County, Clayton County. We moved around a lot. My first school was in Clayton County, J.W. Arnold Elementary School, and we lived in some government projects right behind the historic courthouse. But from there, we moved around, and there was a level of upward mobility in our family. So by the time I got to high school, I was very active. Um, I played football, ran track, did ROTC, and for the first time, I was able to travel outside the state, fly on an airplane, all of that great stuff. And that's really, how my upbringing was. We didn't travel a lot. My mom was afraid to fly on airplanes or get on a boat. And so, I was the first to finish high school. My three older siblings, they all dropped out of high school. And then ultimately, my younger sister, she did finish high school. But my three older siblings did go back and obtain their GEDs. And so that's an accomplishment. And I know my mother did the same, and she ultimately got a little college under her belt before I went to college. And so that's basically K-12, and I can tell the college story, which has a lot more twists and turns.
Okay, we gonna definitely get into them twists and turns. That's where we need to be. But I just want you to talk about, a lot of times, especially in our community, as I mentioned before, my background's in education and athletics, and so I've been a coach, I've been an AD, I've done all those anything athletics I've done, and it's like I see how much our young black males, how they invest, just everything about themselves, their identity, their future, I mean, everything is just balled up into this one thing. And it's like, I have to carry this football, I have to play this basketball, which I always tell people, if God give you a gift to go to school for free, doing what you love, do it, but still know who you are, you know and being in that community where people are pushing sports and they're not talking about being lawyers and doctors. We talk about it, but it's almost like a superhero, but
Mhm.
most of the time it's if you're going to be successful, it's because of basketball, it's because of track, it's because of football. How are you able, going through that journey of where you didn't really see your rest of your family go to school, who was talking about the importance of education? Was it still talked about in your family, or did you just only hear about it mostly when you was in class with your teachers? Like, how are you able to know that, okay, well, my family is able to make it, or my mom and my dad or my brothers or sisters, whoever, okay, but I still want to make sure I get a education. I still want to make sure that it's value. Like, how are you able to maintain, when you're in an environment where education wasn't, you didn't see it? Like,
Mhm.
who was
Mhm.
talking about the importance of education?
I'm glad you asked that because that question really gets at my why. And
Hmm.
that is because when I got to high school, I had a ROTC, that's a Reserve Officer Training Corps instructor, that we had an Air Force ROTC at my high school. And thankfully my mom encouraged me to join that, going from middle school, 8th grade to 9th grade. But we had a gentleman, his name was Ernie Campanone. We called him Sergeant Camp. And he made it, number one, a classroom assignment that
Hmm.
we apply to college. Not only that, he provided us with a stamp and he walked us to the mailbox to mail off the college applications. I had no desire to go to college at all. I had football scholarships, partial scholarships, full scholarships to play football. But because I was so afraid of school and going to school and going off to college because no one ever done it, and I was just over school because again I went to school for lunch and PE. I did not want to go to college, but because I had applied and because he had shown me things over those 4 years, he would spend his nights and weekends taking us to practice, picking us up for practice, taking us trips out of town to compete. He had shown a level of investment in all of us. And I'm
Mhm.
like, wow, like we're not even his kids, and he's doing this for us.
Wow.
And I had a great appreciation. So when he said, fill out this application, it, even though I didn't want to. And so with that being said, I applied and I went to college that first year. And I tell everybody I made all the grades. I got into Georgia State on a Hope Scholarship. I made all the grades A, B, C, D, F, withdraw, fail. And didn't think college was for me. And then I joined the United States Marine Corps. And I joined the Marine Corps and said, you know what, college is for me. And I ultimately went back to college and I never stopped through my bachelor's, master's, and law degree.
Wow. Absolutely amazing. It's so funny that you say that. I I was also a sports head, so I was always running track and that was my thing. And I just remember when I first got to college, it was like I think I was in a science class or something, biology, or I don't even know what it was. And so the instructor was like, okay, all this stuff over here you probably should have learned last year when you was in, high school. And I'm thinking, I don't know none of that stuff on there. Like I had to literally like learn new stuff because I just went through high school just going through it. So yeah, I passed, and then so when people look at me now, a lot of my athletes or coaches and people always talk about, well, you must love school. Like, why did you go get a doctorate degree? Like, and I'm like, no, I don't love school like that. But I knew if I wanted to be in the space where I'm working with males and it's a predominantly, white dominant profession, being an athletic director, I have to have all these letters. I have to have all these experiences. I have to have all this extra stuff. And so my students always laugh because I said I learned to embrace, any kind of learning disabilities or challenges that I had that I didn't know I had, right? So when the teacher went around and had everybody read, I would go to the bathroom, and I would
Mm,
stay there. And
mm,
um, I just did that my whole life. I got away with it my whole life. And I just when I started studying in college, I started learning that, okay, it takes you a little bit longer to read through your stuff. You got to highlight. You have to make sure you put a sticky note to remind you of what you just read. And so that's how I learned. I learned by just reading over and over and writing little notes on the side to help me remember what I just read, for whatever reason. And so I just knew that's how I had to study. Right. And so when you were in that space and now you're deciding, okay, I'm going to go into law, because not only did you go to college, right? Because you could have went and just picked a major to say, okay, I did it. I checked the box. I did the college thing. Now what? But to make such a drastic, going from that to this is not important. I can get through the motion to, if I'm going to do it, I'm going to do it big. And I don't know, how are you able, what was it about your why that said, well, I'm not into school, but I'm interested in this. And in order to get that, I need to have, this. So talk about that journey when you made that decision to go into law in college and what that looked like for you.
sure. So when I went to college, my question was, what can I study that I will enjoy? Because I don't really enjoy school per se. I never performed poorly in school. I was always an A, B student, but I never applied myself either. It just sort of came naturally to me. But when I got to college, it was a new game. And I said, what can I study that's going to hold my interest? And so I majored in criminal justice. And the reason why was because I spent a lot of time growing up in government projects, spent a lot of time at Techwood. I remember at 7 years old, seeing someone shot and killed. And at that point, no one called the police. No one called the police. That's when the red dogs were really big and they were kicking in doors. But in other instances, I had a lot of friends who were in and out of jail. They're older brothers, and ultimately, when I was in high school, a gentleman held a gun to my head, and I actually dared him to pull the trigger. And I tell everybody that was the worst decision I probably could have made in that moment. And I'm just fortunate to be here. But dealing with that trauma, also just dealing with a lot of trauma growing up and seeing everybody. I tell everybody I grew up on the street where there were no fathers, there were no dads. There were single moms and or aunts and uncles, but there was not one family where there was a mother, a father, and the children in the whole neighborhood. And the neighborhood was essentially a street. And so I wanted to understand that dynamic. And so I went and I majored in criminal justice. I had an internship with the Fulton County Drug Court, where part of that internship, I sat at tables and folks were talking about their addictions and how they got started with drugs. And they would say, well, 20 years ago, I started using drugs because of the person right next to me. And so I started seeing some of the nuances and the close relationships. And so my first job in the criminal justice space was with the DeKalb County Sheriff's Office. I did really well. I graduated at the top of the academy. I thought that I would be there for a while. But while I was there, I saw a whole bunch of 18 to 25-year-olds who were essentially illiterate. Many of them couldn't read. Many of them had dropped out of school. And I just, it was heartbreaking. And
Yeah.
I said, this can't be it for me. I said, I don't want to stop here because the change and the impact I want to make, I can't. It's too late. Or if
Yeah.
it's not too late, I don't have the ability to really help like I want to.
Yeah.
And so I was involuntarily called back to active duty with the United States Marine Corps because I served from 2001 to 2009. We were at war for all of those years. But when I got back, when I got off of active duty,
Mhm.
and ultimately, after I obtained my master's degree, so I got a master's degree in criminal justice as well.
Mhm.
I did all of that, and then I could go to law school. I was waiting until I got out of the Marine Corps to go to law school. But it was my experiences from childhood. It was my experiences personally being held at gunpoint. Those are the things that really wanted me to go back and make a difference because I wanted to do something to make communities better than the communities I lived in. And
Yeah.
at the very least, I wanted to, which is selfish of me, I tell everybody, and I don't care. I wanted to save myself. I
Mhm.
wanted to spend the rest of my life doing what Sergeant Camp did for me, doing what my childhood pastor did for me,
Yeah.
doing what my stepfather and other men had done for me, and that's poured into me, which helped me evade prison and drug addictions and even death, like some of my friends. So I lost friends in high school to gun violence. Right after high school, I had friends shot and killed for stepping on somebody's shoes.
Wow.
Shot in the back and paralyzed for breaking up a fight. And so there was a lot of gun violence that I was able to um, escape, but it wasn't on my own. It was because of other people. And so now I would count it as an injustice for me not to spend every waking hour in some way, shape, or form trying to save somebody, pull somebody out of it, because I feel like that's my mission.
Absolutely. That's just so amazing that you talk about that. People always tell our kids, and we always say, oh, that, they're a product of their environment, but that doesn't have to always be something negative. It could be your environment that creates the space or why you're operating where you're at now. Maybe you had to be the person to be in that situation to see that this situation is a problem. And I think a lot of times we run from those. We always run from what we're called to do because
Mhm.
it's hard pouring into people, right? It's hard when you're constantly pouring and you only see a little bit of a change, and at the time you have this big picture in your head. You're like, man, I'm about to go out here and then you're pouring and you're pouring and you're pouring and you're pouring. You're like, okay, like, why am I continuing to pour when I have not seen, you know?
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
I think about how, as being a coach and seeing the young men that came through, who ran track with me in high school, and then I saw what happened to them And then when I got in the system of being in education, because when I graduated from college, they said, "What do you want to do now?" I said, "I just want to coach," you know. And so they were
Mhm.
like, "Okay, good, good. So what do you want to teach?" I was like, "No, I want to coach. Like I'm not doing anything in education." And so they were like, "Well, if you want to coach, you got to teach." So I was like, "Oh, now I got to go back to school, do more school." So went to alternative certification, started teaching. Thought I was going to be 1 year doing it. And so it's just crazy to me when I think about my journey, right? It's like
Mhm.
these seeds were already pouring into you, and now you get to live like in your purpose, even if you don't see the harvest that you feel you're waiting for. But when you start looking back over your life of, oh, I remember this situation, this conversation I had with this person or that person, and I started
Mhm.
thinking about my journey. I remember
Yeah.
sitting in boardrooms where athletic directors and other coaches are trying to get me fired because I'm speaking about life to my athletes. You're supposed to be a coach. Why are you talking about life? Why are you talking about choices? Why are you talking about
Mhm.
challenges of being a Black woman? Why are you talking about those things and you're not talking about track? And so I made a decision then, because this is what I know, because this is who I am. And if I don't teach life to them, who's going to teach them? And so I said, if I can teach you life, I can teach you, I can coach you in track. It's just the same, right? And so I focused on knowing who my student athletes were, who they hung out with. Their parents would call me if they couldn't find their own child, because I would know who to call. Your mom said you need to get home. I don't know what you're doing, but you better get there. And so it was just amazing how I was just operating in what I felt you should do, and started creating championship teams, and people couldn't understand. She doesn't talk about track. She's always talking about life. But they didn't
Mhm.
realize that my relationship with my girls, they started believing in everything that I told them. When I said that you're great, when I said that you're
Mhm.
going to be lawyers and doctors and smart and great wives, and so I always continued to win. So people eventually started questioning and stopped questioning why she's doing what she's doing, because whatever she's doing is working. And so I think about my journey, going through those different things and those challenges and the pushbacks that I got. Talk about some pushback from you, right? Because I know that in our Black community, you going into law, there's this thing where we tell our community that our votes don't matter, and your voice doesn't count, and the police are this, and so we always have this negative outlook on politics and stuff like that. And then here you come talking about you want to be a lawyer, right? So were
Mhm.
people like, oh yes, now we see change? Or did you get any pushback like, you're trying to be a police? We run from the police and you trying to be the police. So talk about what was that like? Because when you're walking in your purpose and maybe not knowing it at the time, you wonder why you have all these challenges. But now, but then, you're just going through it like, why do I want to be, did you ever have that? So can you talk about that experience when you decided this is what I'm going to do? What were the people saying on the good side? And what were the people saying on the other side?
Yeah, and I'll say this first. I never, and I tell students this all the time, I never knew exactly what I wanted to do. Now it's crystal clear. I knew that I wanted to go back and rescue, make an impact, or save my 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12-year old self. I knew I had questions at the age saying, I wish there was someone here to help me, to guide me. And I want now to provide what I didn't have at that time. And I didn't know how I would do it. So when I start working in law enforcement, absolutely, folks were saying, cuz you 12 now? What's going on? I mean, and a lot of folks who I hung out with, right? They didn't necessarily all live on the up and up, which is not a bad thing. You talk about this environment, but some of them had their challenges. Most of my friends didn't really support the idea of me working in law enforcement. No one really just deterred me in a staunch way. I think I got the most pushback when I decided to go to law school. So when I got ready to go to law school, I was recently married. Still married now. I have an 11-year-old son, a 13-year-old daughter. been married for about 15 years, but I was recently married. I had just got a decent job with the Department of Defense doing the type of work I did in the Marine Corps. We purchased our first home, and everything just looked from the outside like, hey,
Perfect.
y'all
Yeah,
on
you
your
got
way.
it
Yeah.
going on.
And I remember listening, I think it was Eric Thomas talking about if you want to be successful in life, because I knew I wanted more and wanted to do different type of work. He said you have to be willing to sacrifice who you are for what you are to become.
Hmm.
And I remember telling my little sister, I'm like, that's it, Lex. I'm going to law school. It's something I've been wanting to do. I said I was going to do it. And now everybody's like, dude, you married? And I finally I got accepted into a number of schools, but all of them were away, meaning Texas, Arkansas,
Mm-hmm.
North Carolina, Florida. I ended up going to North Carolina Central because it was a HBCU. I wanted to go to HBCU law school, but that meant that I had to travel. And they tell you not to do this your first year of law school.
Mm-hmm.
My wife bought tickets for me every other week for the first year, which meant that every other weekend I wasn't studying. I
Right.
was flying home to be,
Boot
and
up.
she was pregnant. My first year, my son was born during exams, and she and I handed my wife my memo that was like the paper for the semester right after she had birthed my son to look over it for revisions. This is not a lie.
You're like, business, like, we need to go business as usual.
But she supported me, but so many people told me your marriage is gonna fail. You should not leave your wife and go live in a whole nother state without them. And I did that for a year. And so that was very hard. And a lot of people, were just like, you shouldn't do that. And I felt bad about it and I doubted myself a lot. And I'll tell you, I didn't see things coming together for me right after law school. I had a job that was promised to me. And after I received an offer, they reneged on the offer and said, we're not filling that position. And so I went back and it was hard. I'll say it was very hard. And I had no dream of being a professor. I
Hmm.
was just trying to do something to give back. I said, I'm not doing well financially. I'm not doing well generally. Let me just give back. That always seems to help. So I went to volunteer at a school, which is in the historic Pittsburgh community, sort of where my dad family's from and my side of the family there. And I just wanted to volunteer. And there's a gentleman named Moses Ector, one of the first African American GBI agents. I said, I just want to volunteer. He said, I don't have any volunteer opportunities, but I have a class that you can teach next week. And it was a class teaching senior law enforcement executives. So I did that. I blew it out of the water. And then he said, you should apply to be a professor. And I did it. And I've been a professor since. And for a while, I worked as a professor full time at night and a staff attorney full time in the day. And now I run a program, two programs, criminal justice and IT for a university, and do some other stuff like private security. But I never dreamed on being a professor. But the work I do right now as a professor, plus what I do with the 100 Black Men of Atlanta, serving as an anti-gun violence committee chair, like it's the ideal job and it's volunteer. And that's the best part about it because I get to do what I want to do and I don't have to feel any type of way about charging people. It's all love. And so I feel like I don't work as much as I work. I feel like it's really just community service.
Wow. 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 I mean, I I always think about, when you're in that space, right? I mean, where you understand your purpose, no matter what challenges come, you're already at the point in your life where you're confident knowing that this is where I'm supposed to be, even if it doesn't feel comfortable, even if I don't see all that I've been thinking that I deserve or want to see. And so when you can continue to walk in that space of your purpose and understanding your why, it has to be a undescribable feeling, because a lot of people struggle with knowing that they're good at something, but knowing that they could be great at another. But because being good at something is comfortable because it becomes natural to you, when you have to be great, And walking in your purpose, there's a journey that comes with that. It's a process that
Mhm.
comes with that. It's going to be harder work that comes with that. You can always go do the easy stuff. But when
Mhm.
you're challenged, when you're walking in this, what you know to be your truth, I mean, it takes us a long time to get to that place. And a lot of us are still searching on what is our purpose. How did you know that you were in that space of accepting, right? Because even though that job was like, hey, you came to do something quick and now you don't got a whole contract,
Mhm.
how were you able to stay, I guess, obedient to that, of saying, well, I know I don't want to be a professor, but now you're a professor. So that was part of that journey. How were you able to submit to that and allow whatever he was putting in your way at that time? How are you able to just continue to accept it? What were you doing for yourself, mentally or whatever, to sustain that?
Yeah, so I will say I had a great aunt who used to call me preacher, right? So they say, late aunt. And my mom used to always dress me up in that way, right? Ultimately, there were a few people in my family, including my mom's father, my grandfather, who served as a preacher and a pastor later on in life. I knew that wasn't for me. I actually was a member of a church here in the metro Atlanta for about 16, maybe even 18 years, had gone over to Africa on the missions trip and missions trips throughout, the city. But I was always told that I should be a preacher. I'm going to be a preacher, and that was my thing. But I always heard people saying, "You're going to be a preacher. You're going to be a preacher." And I said, "No, I'm doing something different." And I think that when it clicked for me is that my ministry doesn't have to be in a church; it can be in the community. I
Absolutely.
started to really embrace and accept it at that point.
Absolutely. Yeah, I tell people all the time, all of us are always sowing seeds. Whether you're doing
Mhm.
someone's hair, that's an opportunity for you to speak life into somebody. If you're cutting somebody's hair, if you're serving somebody at a restaurant, we're all should be serving in some space, And so when people think that you always have to be in the church to walk in your purpose, that's not always true. And so I really appreciate you sharing that part of your journey with us. Um, Brian, can you hear us? I think he's trying to get his service is bad wherever he's at. But
Okay.
when you talk about knowing, how are you able to, like, how did you create your own space of your own company where you knew the type of people that you wanted to be a part of your group? And how was that process for you when you're like, hey, this is what I'm doing, this, how did you get people to align with that and make sure that they don't deviate to something else or change, the mission that you have for your program or your organization now?
That grew organically as well. And so there are two things. Right now, I'm the founder of Teach Us Justice, which stands for Teaching Ethics and Cultural History for Urban Stakeholders. And not only have we traveled throughout the Southeastern United States looking at the evolution of law, policy, and social justice, we being students, professionals, other professors, community stakeholders, but I've recently been fortunate to do different trainings as a consultant on things, most recently like critical race theory. But it just unfolded. And so what happened is in the classroom, just like you, on Fridays when there were no classes, I would have the students meet with me and I would pour into them, give them motivational talks, bring in guest speakers, buy pizza, and we would just hang out. And we would talk and they say, we ought to go to this place. It's in Montgomery, the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, with that Brian Stevenson founded, the great civil rights attorney. And so we took a trip, we took two, we took three, we took four. And they're like, Professor Byrd, you should start a nonprofit doing this. I'm like, no, I'm not starting a nonprofit. And so at their commencement ceremony, they actually gave me hundreds of dollars to pay for all I needed to start a nonprofit. And I told them no, I wouldn't. I said, I'm gonna hold on to the money. And I did. But I just formed an LLC because I had started a nonprofit before and I knew what it entailed. But it was really the students asking me to do it. And I said, you know what, I should because, people want and need these services. And so since then, I've just continued to stick with the mission. of Teach Us Justice. And I've been trying to do it in a more voluntary capacity, but I just get calls and people ask me to do something just based on working with me. And so I've not really asked anybody or solicited work. It just often just falls in my lap.
Wow. I'm laughing because, your whole story is like, I wasn't going to do this. And everything that you said you wasn't going to do, you're doing right now. So now I'm thinking, you keep saying you're not going to be a pastor, but if you keep saying that, it looks like things are working in the opposite direction for you. So you might start claiming it and then won't have to worry about it.
Okay, okay.
That is just so funny. But we do go through that a lot where we're constantly running from something. And when we do get to accept what it is that we think that we're running from and get away from what we think we're supposed to be doing,
Mhm.
it's a great feeling. So thank you for sharing that. Brian, can you hear us?
Yeah, can you guys hear me?
Yeah, I
Yeah.
told him that you was bald head too. I said,
Yeah,
you're
we
gonna
got
be
a little, we
popping
got
up in a minute.
a little connection going here. But yeah, I'm out here traveling. I'm about to head down to New Orleans. I'll be flying out tomorrow, head to Miami, where I'll be helping do and present at a wealth education conference over the weekend. So, just in and kind of listening in on the dialogue and kind of taking us in from where you were just mentioning, falling into something that you say or said that you never would do. Um, I'm sure Sherelle mentioned my academic background is in the social work space, so psychology, social work, so on and so forth. I remember when I was coming up and I would go to the health department and you would see these social workers and I'm like, man, I don't never want to have that job. Like that's the broke fake professionals. And I would always look down and I look back now and how immature were you? But I fell into that space because of what the community needed. And I started to see that need in the community and I took the mantle and just went forward, but I did so in my own way, in my own direction,
Mhm.
starting social businesses that generated revenue to go towards the development of the services, so on and so forth, that I saw a need for. So I throw kudos at you for taking on the responsibility once it fell into your lap and say, you know what, let me just go ahead and pour in where I know I can. Maybe I didn't want to, but I know I can help change some lives. When it comes to, I'm looking at our title here, and I'm trying to think back on specifically what triggered me to title this session this. But I look back at it, especially.
Look at his service is kind of going in and out. Brian, your service is bad. Yeah, I don't think he knows. Yeah, it eventually went out. I'm like, okay, we can't hear you, Brian. You got to repeat all that what you were talking about. So
I
go
go ahead,
ahead.
go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, no, go ahead.
I heard him saying, looking back at like the title, I think it was like education, law policy, social
Mhm.
justice, and safety, or something along those lines.
Yeah.
He was saying, looking back on it, um, I guess what I haven't talked about is the whole safety piece.
Mm,
And I think that even though throughout my life there have been things that I said I didn't want to do, and ultimately you could say I was sort of running. I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do, but I knew who I wanted to work with and
yeah,
the type of work.
yeah,
And it
yeah,
never really materialized, or the opportunities never presented themselves like I thought they would.
yeah,
And now that they've kind of all arrived at one time, it's like, wow, it was like that was just a wild ride. It's interesting. Even me being a business owner now and vice president with Hawk Protection Group. So I'm doing what I do, right? Trying to do extracurricular stuff, do the most in the classroom, and I'm interviewing former directors of the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. That's the premier law enforcement agency here in Georgia who supports all 159 counties whenever there's an officer involved shooting, with their crime labs, you name it, they provide support to all 159 counties. So I'm interviewing one of the former directors and ultimately the current director. But in my first interview with Vernon Keenan, who had served with the agency for about 30 years, 30 plus years, I asked him where he saw the criminal justice system field going, and he said privatized. It's going to be privatized. And so I always listen and I consider it a big deal when someone of his stature says something. So no lie, that day I called the only person I knew who owned a franchise. And I said, how did you get into the franchise business? I think I want to buy a private security franchise. And he put me in touch, and I started calling a guy that I had met at a dinner. I never spoke with him before, who I knew worked in security. And I called him and talked to him about starting a security franchise for about 2 or 3 months. And ultimately he said, we're about to launch. Do you want to be a partner in this? And I said, yes. And so just like that, I'm a partner in the security business, and we launched during COVID. And over the last year, we have done really well, really, really well, like close to 1 million well. And not only that, we've got over 35 full-time employees, and we launched at the height of COVID. And that was really just based on me listening to someone and give me some advice, and I believed them. And again, it's security, it's everything my neighborhood needed as a child. And I'm able to make a difference, but it didn't materialize like I thought it would. It just sort of, I heard something, ran with it, and it just happened.
Wow, that's amazing. And that's what I was telling somebody before, when you begin to walk in your purpose and your plan, when he talked about he has a purpose and a plan for your life, that means he's already put the right, whatever your process is going to look like, he's already put the pieces together for you to be successful. As long as you just stay on course, run your race. And so you continue to run that race, whether you slow down or not, but you continue to push forward and be obedient to the little things that you were hearing. Those little things turned into big things, right? Because other people probably had that same conversation, but didn't do anything about it. They just continue to talk about it being a problem. And I think it's just amazing, because a lot of time people put us in a box of what they think that we should be. And I remember growing up where when you went to college, the only thing they talked to women about majoring in was being a nurse, being a physical therapist, being a lawyer. You didn't hear women talk about being an athletic director or, being some type of development coach, or we didn't hear about those things. So when people were like, well, what made you want to go this route? I knew I didn't want to be a principal, but I knew I wanted to be an athletic director. And so it was like, people were like, why do you worry more about athletics than education? And so I always talk about athletics as an extension of education, and so when you're in this space right now where you're continuing to walk in your purpose with all these different, they may seem different, but they're all aligned, they're all working in together, right? Why was it so important for you to create these different businesses and spaces where our community learn more about their rights? Because I feel like we only learn about them or talk about them when we need them. That's when we find out, oh, hey, you can't do that. Somebody told me, we never know ahead of time. And I remember when I got into education, when I started to experience a lot of racial things from leaders and call me certain names, and I'm like, there has to be something out there. But then I would see my white counterparts, if they weren't happy about something, they would call, I'm calling the union. I'm calling the union. And so we were always taught that, you don't call the union, you don't exercise your rights, just pray about it, avoid the confrontation and keep on plugging. But when you can come back and say, especially as a Black woman, I come in and say, well, I'm going to speak to my union rep. Then it's like, okay, well, you don't have to go that far. Right. And so that's when I started realizing, why am I so afraid to use things that are given to me? Like, these are my rights, but why do I feel guilty about sticking up for myself with using the law that they created? Right. And so why was it so important for you to say, I have to spread this news they need to know more about who they are and their rights and their justice? Like, speak on that space. Like, why was it so important for you to do that?
Yeah, so again, it's really under the umbrella of Teach Us Justice, teaching ethics and cultural history to urban stakeholders. I feel like there's some information that's so vitally important to our communities that we should give that information away. We shouldn't charge for it, which is one of the big reasons why I didn't want to go into the ministry, because I said certain information should be free. And I don't want to receive money for telling people how to better their lives. To me, that's just what you do. And I understand that people should make money and have to make money, but that's what deterred me. And so I saw that, how can I give information and uplift our community in different ways? And I thought I could do it through teaching them about laws, policy, and social justice, because that can add a lot of value to their lives. And it can also help them avoid certain conflicts. And so I've partnered with the Clayton County solicitor, who is also my best friend since like seventh grade, Charles
Oh,
Brooks,
wow.
and did some training for his staff. I do these things called public service awareness forums at the university, that we open it up to the community, where we bring in subject matter experts to talk about, all the trending topics in criminal justice. And all of my tours, I try to make them as close to free as possible, again, with the idea of exposing people. Recently I went into the Georgia Department of Juvenile Justice as part of my work with 100 Black Men of Atlanta. And we listened to about 6 individuals who were detained or in the RYDC for gun violence charges. And we
Mm.
asked them what could have been different. And they said, I just need a male figure to teach